Hello and welcome to another episode of the Phoenix Wisdom Podcast. I am your host, Janet Sandberg. I am a reader, Reiki master, and trauma-informed intuitive life coach, which means that I get to help you discover who you are, why you're here, what's holding you back, and how to move forward with confidence and clarity. And obviously, I am also a mental health advocate, which is why I'm hosting this podcast, due to my own experiences with grief, trauma, suicidal ideation, and the resulting resilience and personal growth. I am here to share stories and hopefully save some lives. Today, we are here with Brian Sachetta. Brian, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, Janet, thanks for having me.
I am excited to hear your story, but before we get into that, tell us a little bit about yourself.
For sure. So, like yourself, I'm a mental health advocate. That stems from my personal experience with mental health conditions. The spiel I usually give is that I'm Brian Sachetta, owner and author of Get Out of Your Head, which is both a brand and book series that seeks to help folks overcome anxiety and depression. But on this show, obviously, we'll be talking more about not necessarily the books, but the experiences and things that I went through. And, I'm always that advocacy piece, right? Is like, I'm here beating the drum because, it means a lot to me. I've struggled with these things. I see it affect other people, and that kind of breaks my heart. And I just want to try to, spread the message of good vibes and also helpful hints along the way.
Awesome. I love it. Yeah. And that's why we're all here. We got to talk about it so that everybody else knows that it's okay to talk about it. So let's talk about it. Let's go back to the deep, dark days when you were feeling like you didn't want to be here. What was going on?
Yeah. So this was starting in 2018, towards the end of the year, started going into a depressive episode that lasted, honestly, for over a year. So, when I talked to my doctor, he was like, this is somewhere between major depressive disorder and dysthymia. Dysthymia being, the prolonged lower grade sense of depression. And I agreed with him. I'm like, there was days where it was completely overwhelming and it was really hard to do anything.
Yeah.
And there were other days where it was like, the dark clouds are hanging over me, but I'm going to work, I'm doing things. I may not necessarily be in the best headspace, but I'm moving along,
Yeah.
So somewhere between, again, major depressive disorder and dysthymia. I'd say most days probably leaning towards dysthymia, but who's counting, right? So it really started to come over me as I was getting ready to publish my first book, which was centered around anxiety and helping folks with anxiety. And one of the things that was so difficult for me was I had almost this imposter syndrome, if you will, right? On the one hand, I was excited. I had completed this lifelong achievement or, long time achievement of wanting to publish a book, write a book. And so I was very proud of that. On the other hand, I didn't totally know why, but I did know that I was not really mentally healthy at that moment, right? And it was because of this depressive episode that was coming on. And so I was pulled in both directions, right? Where I felt like a fraud. I was like, I'm about to publish this book where I tell people how to manage their own mental health, specifically their anxiety, but very much so their mental health, right? And I was not mentally healthy at the time. So that ate away at me. Yeah. So it was almost like I had the depression and then I had the guilt on top of it, And so stop me at any point during this, but I'm just going to kind of go into the episode itself.
Yeah, go for
it. I remember it hitting me in the month of September of that year, 2018. Again, coincided with finishing my first manuscript, getting ready to publish it, that kind of thing. But there was like a specific day where it really hit me was, I chronicled this in my second book. If people are curious, I'm not trying to push it very much, but just, it's all in there if you want to learn more. So where I'll start, right, is I grew up in Boston or in, the suburbs of Boston, and there's a famous large fair in the town that my parents now live in, but close to where I grew up. And we always went there as kids, right? So there was always this sense of nostalgia tied to it of we used to go there with our parents and our friends. And then in high school, people would drive us up to the fair, and there was all sorts of, sometimes we'd find a few beers or whatever it was, right?
Yeah.
We'd kind of have some fun. And, maybe people had a first kiss or whatever at the fair. So all this emotion tied up in it, right?
Yeah.
And so in this month of September 2018, I was talking to my brother. My brother's son was quite young at the time. He would have been 2.5, I think. And so my brother was like, hey, thinking about taking, your nephew to the fair. Do you have any interest in going? So I was like, yeah, let's definitely go. And so we go, we take him. And it was one of those like bittersweet moments where, for one reason or another, I took him on a bunch of the rides, the merry-go-round, just the kiddie rides or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember being on the merry-go-round and having this moment where I was like, oh my God, like it just crushed me. I saw him on the merry-go-round, and I'm thinking to myself, it's one of those flashback moments filled with all that nostalgia. And I'm like, oh my God, I remember, maybe not at 2.5, but I remember being young and having my parents take me on this ride. And it was just this overwhelming feeling of where the hell did the time go? And life is flying by and flashing before my eyes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So almost this impending sense of doom, right? If those years went by that fast, the next years are going to go by pretty quickly as well. And so I was sitting in that. I was kind of like trying to process it, but I didn't exactly know how to. Try to have a good time with my family, right? It's like taking my nephew to the fair, wanted to enjoy that. But I just didn't entirely know how. And so eventually we left the fair. I went home that night, and it was just like, I don't know if I'm going to use the word fate or anything like that, but it was certainly like cosmically ironic, right? Was I'm in this high stress state of wondering like, oh my goodness, like how did life go by so quickly? And I go home and I open my email and I see this email, and it's, a lot of spam emails will go directly into your spam inbox or whatever you want to call it, spam folder. This one made it through, and it has all these different messages in it. It's like, the title says like, hey, Brian, does this look familiar? And I'm like, oh, and it came from, mike.smith@gmail or something like kind of common,
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily a bunch of random, letters and numbers strung together. And so I open it and it says, hey, I hope this looks familiar to you. It's actually the password to, like this specific account. I think I want to say to your email, right? And the person says, by the way, I hacked into your computer. I have all your sensitive information. I know that you went on a bunch of websites, you shouldn't have gone on, and I hacked into your webcam. I have footage of you,
What?
like, let's say being on adult websites, whatever, right? And they were like, if you don't send me money within 24 hours, I'm going to release the footage to everybody in your address book. And I was like, oh my God, if I wasn't doomed at the fair, my life is over. It's completely over.
Wow.
And so I'm sweating, like just completely unsure of what to do. And eventually I was like, okay, like the video's not out yet. And, it wouldn't have been, and it's one of those things where it's like, if we're being totally candid, right? It's like a lot of men will use, pornographic websites.
Yeah,
it's a thing.
sure.
We don't want to talk about it. We don't want anybody to see that we do that. But
Mm-hmm.
if somebody were to, we all do it, and a lot of us do it. And if it were to be exposed, even though we're all doing it, it would be so humiliating and so embarrassing.
Of course.
So I was like, my life is over, And so I'm like, okay, the video's not out yet. Let me just take a breather. Let me just figure out what to do here. And eventually I just paused and I was like, okay, like not necessarily what's the worst that could happen, but I was like, let me do some digging here. Let me try to like calm myself down for a minute and just think about alternatives, right?
Mm-hmm.
And eventually I was like, okay, let me just like take parts of this email and drop it into Google and see if like somebody else has gotten this before.
Oh, yeah, good idea.
And at some point I found that it was like a fairly common scheme that people would run, a scam where they were trying to essentially like, they'd ask you to send them Bitcoin or some crypto that, was hard to trace, right? And so I was like, okay, I'm fairly certain that this was not actually what it was presented to be. And when I thought about it even further, I was like, silly me, I used the same password across the entire internet, which you really shouldn't do if you're
Correct.
listening. And so what ended up happening was most likely one of the smaller sites that I had used got hacked, and that information made it onto, the black market or whatever. And then that person presented it in this convincing way as to be like, I don't just have some random website's password, I have your computers and I have your Gmails and all that, right? So eventually I'm like, okay, I dodged a freaking bullet on that one, but I'm still totally spooked. And so I go upstairs to my room that night, and I'm still, it had been a scary, stressful day. So I'm like, just still in that headspace, And so I log on to my computer again, and I go on to this website where I used to get like my technology news, and I see this article there, and it's, that cartoon meme of the dog that's like sitting at his coffee table and the room is engulfed in flames, and he just says, "This is fine."
It's
and I was
fine.
like, "Oh,
everything's fine."
Yeah, I was like, I like that meme, and I wonder what's going on here. So I'm intrigued. Let me click on it. And so I clicked on it, and it was essentially like this really dark article about climate change. And I had heard about the notion of climate change and this vague idea as to the planet is warming and stuff like that. But I was just such in a headspace that night, right, where I read it and I really went deep, and I was like, oh my God, no, not only is my life flashing before my eyes, but like we're destroying the planet, XYZ. I went deep and far and wide, right?
Yeah.
And so I remember going to bed that night, if I did sleep all that much. It was a very stressful day. It was an existentially angsty day. And I'm just thinking to myself, I'm going to be dead soon. The whole planet's going to be dead soon, right? I'm in such a bad headspace. And I couldn't really shake that for a long time. That was really the entry point into the depression. But then from there, it was more like once you're in that headspace, again, it becomes hard to get out of it.
Yeah.
And almost in the sense of like, not the law of attraction, but, like the frequency at which your mind is humming, you attract things on that same level.
Yeah.
To put it more concretely, when you're feeling bad, you see all the bad in the world, right?
Absolutely.
So every day I'm waking up for a solid few weeks there being like, the world's a terrible place. We're all going to hell in a handbasket. Why try? Why live? Why exist? That kind of thing. And so I quickly fell into this, what I would call almost like a nihilistic downward spiral, right? Of thinking life is so short. You're going to die soon. Why exist? Why do anything? What's the point of life if we're going to blow the planet up anyway, right? And I know that's a lot, so I'm going to like pause there for a moment, but I will say is like looking back, I'm like, in a different headspace now. And to me, it's like, oh yeah, it makes so much sense that you would feel so horrible if you were entertaining those thoughts all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's just us telling ourselves stories that we believe. And which is basically all of mental health, but that's the hard part, is to stop that and get out of it and move on to better thoughts and get out of being stuck there.
Absolutely.
So how did you do that?
I guess I have just a little bit more of the story that I want to share, and then we can get into more of the like how to get out of it, that kind of thing. And I do just want to be careful, right? It's a sensitive subject. It's tough to talk about. It's not always like when folks are listening, they're going through something hard. It's not always necessarily like, hey, I just got out of it, right? Sometimes it takes a lot of pain, a lot of time, that sort of thing.
Yes.
But so I'm in this headspace for a while. I remember like I went on a vacation with my friends, and it was, we went to Europe. It was supposed to be this awesome like boys trip, right? And I'm in like Eastern Europe where it's gothic and dark and all that. And I'm just in the worst headspace imaginable. And I can't think of anything else. And one thing that I'll be totally honest, like I was ashamed of it, and I still am a little bit, even though I have since talked about it with my friends, is, I eventually ended up chronicling a lot of this in my second book. And one of my friends who was on the trip, he read the book and he texted me and he's like, dude, like WTF, like I was on the trip with you. Like, you didn't tell me this was going on. And I said to him, I was like, it's, I know it's going to seem insulting, but like, I didn't have any idea what to do.
Yeah.
Like I wasn't in the right headspace. I didn't know how to broach the subject. And what was that like at the time? My thought process was like, what am I going to do? Tell everybody, the planet's on fire, we're going to die and life is meaningless, that kind of thing, right? I was like, that made no sense to me. And I'm not saying that any of that is true, right? But that was the story that was playing out in my head. And so, again, like maybe I haven't said this before, but I think men, and also myself included, right? We struggle with the mental health stuff a lot because we suppress so many of these stories and these emotions. And it's something that I try to get better with over time. I put my hand up and say, like, I'm still not amazing with it. I'm a work in progress, as we all are. But, part of the reason that I write my books and blogs and go on podcasts is to try to improve at that skill, right? And just have that candor and tell folks and show folks that, it is hard, but you can be honest with folks and yourself and eventually find a way through it. So I guess getting back to the story, right? I went on this vacation. I was just so horribly depressed and just messed up in the head for the whole thing, right? It should have been fun. I did not have any fun whatsoever. And I remember just saying to myself, like, you just got to get home. Like, just make it home.
Yeah.
And when I got home, I was like, okay, like, I'm no longer in this foreign situation. I'm home. I feel safer, right? But I'm still in that headspace. And I was like, okay, I think maybe I might be able to do this, And then my mom calls me a few days later and she's like, in so many words, your grandmother is on her deathbed. And
oh, no.
Yeah, and this is where I get a little sad. My grandmother was somebody that was really important to me. One of the people I've probably been closest with in my life. And so it was I always dreaded the day that, it's like, it's a grandparent, like they're going to pass away, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And that hung over me for a really, really long time. And eventually, like shortly thereafter, she passed away. And I remember being at the services and just feeling like completely shattered and alone. Just thinking to myself, like, I've been in this horrible, horrible space for the last couple months, and like it just keeps getting worse and I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And it's challenging, right? When you're in that headspace and those things happen to you. And again, those stories that you tell yourself, being at her services, I was just in such a bleak headspace thinking to myself, like, I just lost one of the people that is closest to me in my life. What's the point?
Yeah.
Why keep going?
Yeah.
Why go on? Like, this is just a horrible, prolonged suffering,
Yeah.
What is the point of all of this? That is kind of the backdrop that I have to give to talk about the depressive episode, right? And where obviously the podcast, right, is talking about, we're talking about suicidal ideation. Obviously, when you have thoughts like that, I'm not going to sit here and say that I was like, hey, I'm going to do it. But when you're in that much pain, I was like, it seems like an alternative,
because we just want that pain to stop
and to be done with it. Yeah. And
Yeah.
so it also was like, there were times where, rational me, I'm like, I'm not gonna off myself. That's not gonna happen. And like emotional me was like, almost like kind of like my OCD coming in and being like, you almost have to. What other choice do you have? This is complete misery, all I can really say is like, I white knuckled it as best as I could. Eventually, like, I talked to my mom about it. I talked to my dad about it. I was not in therapy at the time. I would recommend to my younger self that if I went through that again, I would be in therapy. What helped me the most, to be totally honest, was like just sinking myself into literature around depression, because I felt as though, again, like I had just kind of hit the button to submit my first manuscript, and that was on anxiety. And I had So I did really feel like I had something of a grip on that condition.
Right.
When I looked at mental health in general, I was like, oh, maybe not. But when you're in that dark headspace, everything looks cloudy, even the parts that you're like, hey, I do have a grip on this.
Yeah.
So I had gone through what I would call a major depressive disorder in late college. So this was really only like the second bout of depression that I had ever really had. So my experience on the anxiety front was larger, more vast, that kind of thing. And that drove me to find answers, eventually write my first book. With depression, I was kind of like, hey, in college I had this depressive episode, but I haven't been depressed in a while. So, the impetus, the need wasn't really there, right?
Yeah.
But then when this episode in 2018 really came over me, it was like, this is my current problem and I need to find a way through it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really just was like, okay, the last time that I dealt with something like this, right, I tried to inform myself. I tried to find as much information as I could. I tried to just continue moving forward, taking action, that sort of thing. So, I really I'm not saying I recommend all of these things, but like in about 6 months during that time window, I read like 30 books on depression. And I was just determined to like find more information out about this condition, how people live with it, how people get through it, that sort of thing. What was honestly most helpful for me was like learning about this thing called the biopsychosocial model.
Mm-hmm.
It's really just like a high level framework for evaluating and possibly treating diseases. And so when you apply the lens of the biopsychosocial model to depression, you essentially get 3 different buckets, right? So you get the biological, the psychological, and the social.
Okay.
And all it is really trying to say is that like depression can be a disease or a condition that manifests from different areas of your life. And those areas can interact with one another and make each other worse or make the feelings associated with those different buckets worse.
Mm-hmm.
So it really allowed me or forced me to look critically at my life and say, okay, on the biological front, is there anything that I need to address? The same thing goes on the psychological side and the social side. And when I really stopped to think about it, right, we talked about some of the things around, what drove me into that depressive episode. So it was like, unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to bring my grandmother back to life, but I have to find a way to get through this grief.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, right? Sometimes people will say there's like a grief exception with depression where if you're going through grief, that is not always labeled the same thing as depression because it's like a normal, even though it's a horrible feeling that you're going through when you lose someone. For me, I was in this depressive episode before I lost her, and that just kind of magnified everything. So I basically was like, I kind of have to put that piece on hold and figure out how to get through the grief. But the other areas of my life, I think I can break those down and find some ways forward or find some interesting paths for myself. Another part of the story that I didn't entirely mention, or I don't know if I mentioned it at all, was during that year. So in 2018, I had been writing my first book or putting the finishing touches on it. And I was in a job where, I was a salesperson. So any given week, the schedule could be kind of all over the place. And sometimes I'm working long hours, especially if it's the end of the month or the quarter. I'm trying to make quota, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was in that job, I said to myself, I came up with this narrative to say, if I could get out of this job, if I could get a better job, a different job where I have more control over my schedule, where I have more ability and more flexibility to work on my writing, then I'm going to be happy, or at least happier.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did, I went online and looked for different opportunities. I eventually started doing like remote software development for a couple different firms.
Oh.
And when that first started, I was so excited. I was like, yeah, I get my schedule back. I can work wherever I want to work, that kind of thing. And one of the projects that I was on, which kind of became the only project I had for a good while, it was like a great organization, really great people, but just no work there. And it was kind of one of those gigs where like the company they want consultants at the beck and call kind of thing, but they didn't really have work for us to do.
Cool.
But we still had to like report to the office and pretend to be busy. And if we asked for tasks, they'd be like, just find something to do, right? And what I would say is for myself and for folks who deal with anxiety and depression, things like that, your mind is constantly like it can be a positive thing that your mind is constantly looking out for threats and problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
They will often say that if you go back 100,000 years ago, the anxious personality was actually one of the most important personalities in the tribe.
Right.
Because that was the person who said, look out for this danger, look out for that danger. We are very vulnerable out here in the wild, right?
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward 100,000 years later, or however many years you want to put on it, right? That same mental process, even though it had its importance previously, and it can sometimes lead you away from danger, or get you out, like make it so that you don't come upon more dangers. For the most part, right? Especially when we don't have a lot to do, when our minds are not occupied, that mind can become your worst enemy, and it can create problems when they don't exist. It can drive you into madness and just make you totally unhappy, right? So in this job that I was in, again, it was like there wasn't a lot of work to do. And so I'm sitting at my desk kind of twiddling my thumbs. Meanwhile, my mind is just driving me insane,
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was doing that breakdown of like the biopsychosocial model, eventually it hit me as to say, like, it's obviously it's a first world problem, if you will, right? I was still getting paid a decent amount of money to kind of do nothing, but it was not something that was serving me in my mental health. And so eventually I was like looking at that model, right? Kind of specifically looking at the social side, right? Which is basically the kind of the catch-all, if you will, right? Is the what's your job like? What are your friends like? What are your relationships like? What's your neighborhood like? All that, I looked at my social bucket and said to myself, I'm not in a relationship. I'd like to be in one, but I don't know where to start with that right now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in this job that I told myself I would be happy about, and yet I'm not. And so it was, again, that sort of like double layer, kind of like, I don't know, getting punched in the face twice, right? Where it was not only was I, in the first scenario, it was like, not only was I depressed, but I felt huge guilt about being depressed. In this situation, it was like, not only was I unhappy with the job, but I felt like buyer's remorse, or whatever the right term is,
Right.
of saying to myself, like, I'm not just unhappy, I can't believe that I thought I was going to be happy, because I'm miserable.
This is not it.
Exactly. So essentially, like, what it came down to was, one, getting more information about depression itself and learning from other folks who had gotten through it before, and kind of like picking up the best tips and tricks and that kind of thing. But two, and more importantly, was like slowly beginning to rebuild my life, and get to the point of saying, look, like, you have no passion in your life. You have no excitement. Your mind drives you crazy because you don't have that excitement.
Yes.
If you start to rebuild those areas of your life, then maybe this thing will start to retreat a little bit. And it did take time, but I honestly would say, like, once I got back into some meaningful work, my mind quieted down and I had something to focus on. And I think in general, a lot of us, could use something to focus on. I would also say that in some ways, that depressive battle, I do kind of think, like, I almost see it, and I don't know if I'm wrong in this, but I almost see it as like the gauntlet into adulthood. I would certainly consider myself to have been more of a kid or a boy before that. And then after that, it was kind of like coming to terms with my mortality, just the fact that life is, it's kind of fleeting and it's really challenging, and you struggle, but whereas, like, when I was in the depressive episode, all of those things drove me crazy. On the other side of it, I'm like, you know what? That's kind of how life is, and we get through it the best we can. You have some highs, you have some lows, you do the best you can. And it was like during that depressive episode, like, I was so afraid of death and dying and all that. And, if I really thought about it super hard right now, like, the concept of death is spooky, But today I think about it and I'm like, it kind of doesn't seep in, it's almost like my mind is a different soil now. The seeds will not plant themselves in that mind, at least today, and they haven't for a while. And so it's kind of like reconnecting to the small things in life. I cited in that second book, I had read a different book while I was depressed. It's by Leo Tolstoy. It's called A Confession.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to be honest, like, and I'm certainly not trying to trash the guy. Like, it's just a dark book, and that's why I might not recommend it. Like, it's
yeah.
especially if you're in that
Tolstoy is
headspace,
not
right?
known for being particularly uplifting. So
Exactly. But I will say, like, even though that book is super dark, because it's like the same, like, and when I was reading it, I was kind of like awestruck, because I'm like, I almost feel like I'm going through this same exact thing right now that he was, which was he had this existential crisis, wondering what the meaning of life was, wondering if there's any point to it, and why you're born just to be, killed and see everybody that you love die. And obviously, when you look at life through that lens, it's horribly depressing.
yeah.
But what got him through was reconnecting to life, finding God, or, quote unquote God, in every moment, the magic in every moment. And,
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I was filling out the survey for the show that we're doing here, and one of the questions was like, what's one of your favorite things about having survived suicidal ideation, and like, what are you most proud to have done? What are you most excited about? That kind of thing. And honest to God, it's like those little moments of going to a coffee shop and having a nice cup of tea and doing some work that I enjoy, or connecting with a friend and like going to the beach and just having a nice conversation. It sounds kind of ridiculous because, we're all taught to chase the Lamborghini and the tight body and the nice clothes and all that. But like, honestly, like, the juice in life is those little special moments.
Yeah.
And I'm happy that I got through that depressive episode one way or another. And that's not tooting my own horn. I'm just saying that I'm here,
Mm-hmm.
And I'm especially grateful for those little moments, because that's what makes us human. And that's what makes life, rich and worth living.
Yes. Yes, it does. And it's so true. I mean, yes, we can strive for those the big flashy things, the dream job or home or vacation or whatever, and those are wonderful as well. They just happen less often. So if we can look for those little moments, those, as the meme floating around says, the glimmers, that's really what it's about, being here. And it was the same last night. We were in, we're living in the dream house now for us, and it has a
Congrats.
pool, and we were in the pool last night. And for some reason this year we have a gajillion frogs in our pool, and they all come out at twilight. And there was one, he was sitting right on the edge of the pool and croaking away. And like, I swam right up to it. I'm sitting there, I'm inches away from this frog. And you can see like his throat is all like blown up like a balloon when he's croaking. And I'm just watching this frog for like 5 minutes make these chirping noises and talking to his friends. And I'm like, this is it. These are the moments where you just get to experience being here. And there's really nothing to them. I was like watching a frog croak, but
Yeah, it's
but it was
beautiful.
magical just because I was there, and it's not something you get to do every day, and you just appreciate those moments as they happen.
Most definitely. Yeah, it's certainly beautiful, and looking for that beauty in life. That's what gives us the juice, One thing that came to mind as you were telling it, what I almost thought you were going to say, we have the dream house, and yet we've got this frog infestation, right? So like, on the one hand, like, very important, and I give you a lot of credit for finding the beauty in that moment. The other thing too, right, and it kind of ties into the story that I told of, we often think to ourselves like, I'm going to get to this destination, this place, and everything's going to be magical and perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And when you really get down to it and you look at life and all the different opportunities that come your way, you realize that to live is to have problems.
Mm-hmm.
And it really comes down to what problems are the good ones and which ones do you want to try to solve and which ones do you want to try to have, right?
Mm-hmm.
So having a dream house with frogs, but a frog on the side of the pool that you can look at, that seems like a good problem based on how you framed it, you know?
Exactly.
Whereas like we have that sometimes that disillusionment of, oh, I finally bought the Lamborghini that I was trying to buy, and yet now I have a scratch on it, and oh my goodness, I thought it was supposed to be perfect, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like coming to terms with that imperfection and the fact that there are problems in every area of life that, just every area of life and everything that we do. The only people who don't have problems are the dead people. And so
Yes.
we have to figure out what are the problems that we find interesting, which ones juice us up, and which ones do we want to go after and try to solve and find beauty in.
Mm-hmm. And also, when you were talking about the whole, biopsychosocial framework and like really assessing what is going on in your life and what are the things that I have control over and I can change to make improvements. Because, that saying, nothing changes if nothing changes. You can sit there and be like, wow, my life sucks and I hate it. But you keep doing the same thing day after day, year after year. Well, nothing is going to change if you don't change anything about it. So I love those three different sort of containers for things. Biologically, what can I change to make myself feel better? Maybe I could eat a little healthier than I have been, which and it's all, starting off with tiny steps. Maybe I can eat one more piece of fruit every day or a vegetable every day. Eat more protein. Just trying that, socially. Look at your relationships, your friendships, your relationships at work, and how can I change that? How can I change what was the psycho? Yeah, you know,
Absolutely. Yeah.
all the
Psychologically,
things that fall into those things. What can I change?
no doubt. Yeah. I mean, the thoughts and beliefs that we have swirling in our minds, right? Those play an instrumental role in our mental health. So it does make sense to look critically at not only that psychological bucket, but the other two as
Yeah.
well. And something that I love about the biopsychosocial model and what we're talking about right now is kind of drawing a parallel back to depression itself and like, what does it really mean, right? So if you read some literature about depression, you'll eventually get to the point that depression is a condition of pervasive helplessness and hopelessness.
Yeah.
Folks will often say, and there are studies, I think Martin Seligman was the one who ran the kind of famous ones surrounding dogs that like give up in a stressful environment that is out of their control. And the term that they gave to the dogs who essentially like experience, stressors or physical shocks in this environment that they're in, or a cage or a box or whatever it was, but don't have the ability to turn the shocks off. They kind of lay down and take it, right? And the term that they assign to that, as in the researchers, is learned helplessness. And so a lot of folks will say that, again, helplessness, hopelessness, and also learned helplessness, those things are all very closely associated with, if not basically the same thing as depression.
Yeah.
And so if you think about those terms and you say like, okay, what are the opposite of those things? It would be hope and it would be agency, actually.
Yeah.
And so when you think about, okay, you had said, Janet, how do I analyze my life? How do I find actions that I can take, right? Those little actions. Once you start to put like one foot in front of the other, or you have a little win on top of another little win, and so on and so forth, you're creating more of that agency. You're getting the flywheel in your mind turning again. And once you feel as though you have enough of that agency, I'm not going to say that you're going to think you're Superman or Superwoman, but like you're going to feel a little bit better. And then you're going to go take actions in the world that lead you to better circumstances. And eventually you'll be like, I am not helpless anymore. I'm not sitting down and dying and taking it. I'm going to go do things in my life. I'm going to move with agency. I'm going to lead myself in a positive direction. And once you have that sort of internal confidence, you're like, I think you will notice that the depression is like, I'm not going to say it's entirely gone, but it doesn't have the same hold over you that it once did.
Yeah, exactly. And I also love that part where you were saying how, you had this sales job and you had no control over the hours and the work and all of that. So you got another job that you thought was going to be better, but then it wasn't. It was just not good in a different way. And I think we also have to give ourselves grace in those situations rather than being like, well, I made a change and, everything still sucks. Be like, that's okay, because we're not perfect. We can't know everything about everything all the time. And be like, okay, so I'll try again, and not get discouraged if we make a change or take one of those small steps and it's not enough, or it's not what we thought it was going to be, to keep going. Be like, okay, well, readjust the sails, try again.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I will say it can be discouraging because, when you change a job, when you get out of a relationship, those are big, big decisions. And when they don't play out the way that you envisioned, you're inevitably going to be like, what did I do? And what do I do next? Right? Finding yet another job, another relationship, like that's scary and difficult work. And so I think, to your point, right? Like being a little bit more compassionate with ourselves and understanding that, like, there are challenges, and yet at the same time, right, like treating ourselves as if we are a good friend, talking to ourselves as if we are maybe even a best friend, right? You think about like the verbiage that you use and the tone that you use when talking to somebody else that you love that is struggling. Most of the time, like the way that you talk to a best friend and the way you talk to yourself is different. We're much more critical of ourselves. And yet, like, so when we're talking to ourselves and we're honest, we're like, I wouldn't talk this way that I talk to myself to my best friend, right? And so maybe we need to do a little bit more of that and have that compassion. And the other thing that I would say, right, around the theme that I had kind of mentioned earlier of, candor and openness and that kind of thing, is it's funny to me where, like, even though the depressive episode was bad and I was not willing to be open and honest at that time, I think about it and I'm like, if I had a better catalog of what was going on in my life at that time, and I just had an honest conversation with, a loved one or a therapist or somebody who was like informed and helpful. And again, I'm not saying that I didn't talk to anyone. I talked to my parents and whatnot, but if I had talked to more people, and specifically somebody who could look at things objectively without so much of the emotion that was clouding my eyes, it's almost hard not to say that, like, they would be, hey, look, dude, you don't like your job. You are, you want to be in a relationship. You're not in one. Your grandmother just passed away. You're turning over all these scary ideas about climate change in your mind. No crap, you're going to be depressed. You need to make some changes. I love you. I'm not trying to be, incredibly critical of you, but like, that's what you need to do, right? And so I think a lot of the times when we get those ideas out of ourselves and bounce them off someone else, they can just see things much more objectively than we can, because again, we have that emotion that clouds our eyes.
Yes, 100%. And it's funny, my husband always does the same thing. He'll be stuck in something and he'll tell me about this situation, whatever's going on, and I'm like, well, boom, boom, boom. Here's the summary, here's what you need to do about it. And, he's like, how do you do that? I'm like, well, first of all, I'm a life coach, so I have some training in how to do that. Second of all, I'm not so deep in the weeds with the emotions around it that I can see it objectively. And yeah, like you said, and it doesn't have to be anybody who's professionally trained, just somebody who's just that one step removed to have that perspective on things.
No doubt your husband is a lucky man.
Thank you. One last question is that I like to ask all of my guests. What would you tell the person who is in the middle of that depressive episode and going through it?
On top of everything that we've talked about thus far, right? It would honestly be like a message of love and solidarity. I know it might come off as a little cheesy, but like most folks that I talk to who are going through depression, I'll say, like, honest to God, like, even if I don't know you that well, we're both humans. I love you. I hope you know that you have worth and you have value. And one day things are gonna change. Things are gonna get better. I know you can't see it right now and it's incredibly painful, but I'd ask you to try to hold on, right? And lean on me and your other resources. Yeah, it's really, again, love and solidarity. That's kind of it.
Yes, you're not alone. Yeah, absolutely. That's why we do this. That's why I do the podcast. That's why you're here sharing your story, is to let our listeners know that we've been there and we're still here. We're doing well. And yeah, they're not alone. Thank you so much, Brian, for being here today. I appreciate your candor and vulnerability. And yeah, I appreciate you.
Thank you, Janet. I appreciate the opportunity. And yeah, it's always nice to tell the story and try to help folks. So I hope that I did that today.
You sure did. Thank you for listening. Remember that you are loved, you are worthy, you are valuable, you are meant for more, and that it really does get better. If you are in crisis, there are numbers that you can call or text to get the help that you need. That information for Canada and the US is in the description below each episode. If you are in immediate crisis, please call 911. We love you, and I hope you'll listen again.